is a line you hear sometimes that inflation is just the cost of living. But if you listen closely, you realize that it's not describing the world, it is actually quietly shaping it. There is a certain moment standing in a supermarket aisle or reviewing a rent contract where the numbers just don't feel higher. They feel unfamiliar, like somebody has actually changed the rules while you were busy living your life. The first time I really understood this, I didn't get angry, I just felt smaller. Today I want to talk to you about inflation not as a headline or a crisis, but as a structural phenomenon, the silent force that shifts wealth, power, and security in ways we rarely discuss honestly. If you think inflation is just a blip or something governments are always fighting against, I think you're missing the deeper story. We'll look at why inflation exists, how it quietly shapes winners and losers, and why even as the world changes, as new payment systems and rising economies challenge the dollar itself, the logic of inflation remains the same. And in the end, what no one admits about who actually benefits. So I'm curious, have you ever felt like your money just stopped going as far as it used to? Not because you changed, but because the system around you did. And did you chalk it up to bad luck, or did you suspect there was something deeper at work, something bigger at play? If you have a story or just a feeling, please do leave it in the comments. Let's have a nice debate. Before we dive in, a very quick note. My book, Awake, the Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Self-Lies, is now out. It's not just about critical thinking, it's about reclaiming clarity in a world full of noise. If you're a builder, a leader, or just somebody who wants to think more clearly under pressure, this one is definitely for you. I've also now added a 24-minute companion podcast that walks through key concepts in depth, so if you prefer to listen and reflect, this is now included as well. All the links are down below, including a launch video that goes deeper into these themes. There's also a subscriber discount, so hit that subscribe button and check it out when you're ready. And one more final thing before we dive in. I'm building a course on AI fluency for people who want to understand the technology shaping the next decade, as I am a computer scientist by training. If you want to help shape what the course becomes, I've made a very short 8-question quiz. It literally takes like 2 minutes tops, and your answers will directly decide the content that I build next. The links are down below. I'd really love your input. Anyway, let's get into the story. They say that in a well-run system, inflation is just background noise. I kind of think about that a lot because for most people, it's anything but. Groceries cost more, rent eats up more of your pay, and every raise feels like it evaporates before you even notice. The first thing to understand is that inflation is not some fluke or even an accident of policy. It is literally woven into the architecture of modern finance, like the slow heartbeat that keeps the whole system moving. And for all the headlines about central banks fighting inflation, there is a quieter truth that almost every powerful institution is, at best, managing inflation, not erasing it. Because the uncomfortable reality is that inflation and economic growth are deeply entangled together. When prices rise steadily, it's often a sign that the wheels of the economy are turning, that people are spending, borrowing, investing, and the system is expanding, what we want. That expansion is what we measure as GDP growth. Remove inflation entirely, and you're not just squeezing prices, you're risking the engine itself. To erase inflation isn't a return to stability. It's an invitation to stagnation or worse. If prices don't move, neither do profits. Companies will stop hiring, investments stall, and the whole system just can tip into a recession. It's a bit like cooling an overheated engine by shutting it off. You solve one problem, sure, but you create another, far more visible one. This is why central banks try to meet targets for inflation, 2% and not 0. The goal isn't to eliminate inflation, but to keep it low and predictable, just enough to keep the gears turning without the public noticing the slow drift. If inflation ever truly disappeared, the same institutions calling for restraint would be the first to panic as growth evaporated and the specter of recession appeared at the door. So while the language of fighting inflation is everywhere, what they're really fighting is volatility, the fear that inflation might break free from its invisible leash. Erase it entirely and the cost is paid not in lower prices, but in lost jobs, stalled incomes, and the kind of economic anxiety that no one really wants to own. But this wasn't always the way. There was a time when money was tied to something solid, gold, silver, a pile of metal in a vault. It's almost hard to imagine now, but back then governments couldn't just create more money to solve their problems. Every dollar printed had to be justified, anchored to something real and tangible. And when economies did run into inflation, it was a signal that something had gone wrong, usually war, collapse, or a catastrophic failure of discipline. You couldn't just print your way out of a crisis. You had to raise taxes, admit mistakes, or sometimes just surrender. But the world has definitely changed, first through the pain of the Great Depression, then the devastation of World War II. Suddenly, price stability wasn't enough. Policymakers needed tools, not handcuffs, and that's when inflation went from being a symptom to a solution. If you owed more than you could ever pay, let the value of your debts melt away. If you needed to restart an economy, make tomorrow's money worth just a little less than today's. It was elegant, almost invisible, and it kind of worked. The turning point was 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, severing the final link between the dollar and gold. He didn't just change American policy, he rewired the world itself. Suddenly, money became an instrument of confidence and not substance. You couldn't trade your dollars for gold anymore. You could only trade them for more dollars. This is when inflation became not just tolerated, but maybe engineered. The rules shifted. Money could be created in theoretically infinite quantities as long as belief held. Governments could borrow beyond obvious limits, and banks could create credit almost without any friction. If you ever wondered why those at the top always seem to come out ahead during crises, this is part of the answer. In an inflationary system, the logic of wealth kind of flips. Holding cash becomes self-sabotage. Debts, especially fixed, low interest rates, become lighter over time. Assets, especially real ones, climb in price, outpacing both inflation and wage growth. This is not a conspiracy, it's just arithmetic. If you're close to the source, you receive the new money first before prices adjust. By the time it reaches the wage earner, the ordinary people, their real value has kind of already slipped away. Economists call this the Cantillon effect, but it's just an old story with new names that the powerful eat first. And yet there is a paradox. For all quiet unfairness, the alternative is even harsher. A world without inflation is a world where debt becomes a prison. Every dollar you owe must be paid back with dollars just as strong as the day you borrowed them. Credit freezes, defaults cascade, and systems collapse. So policymakers walk a line, let inflation chip away at value, but never let it run wild. And here's the thing, that costs don't vanish. They just get spread out thin and wide until most people don't really realize what's being taken. There is a simple truth about inflation, my friends, that it rewards ownership and not labor. This is why, over time, the distance between those who own assets and those who rely on wages quietly widens, almost regardless of political systems or government promise. You see this everywhere, from Toronto to Sao Paulo to Berlin. In practical terms, if you own a house or a business or even a modest portfolio of stocks, inflation quietly lifts your net worth. If you rent, rely on salary, or save diligently, inflation acts as a tax that you never really voted for. And it isn't random. It tends to push wealth upward to those who already have access to leverage and capital. And this is not just a Western or American story. When the dollar became the world's reserve currency, it exported this inflation logic worldwide. Other countries found themselves caught in the same cycle, expanding credit, chasing growth, trying to keep up. And now, as new coalitions like the BRICS look for alternatives, building payment systems designed to bypass the dollar, the narrative shifts, but the core mechanism still remains. Whether the world trades in dollars, yuan, or new basket of currencies, who knows, the gravitational pull of inflation remains because it's rooted in the structure of credit itself. Whenever somebody promises a system free of inflation, a return to gold, a new digital currency, a multipolar reserve, I find myself a little skeptical, to be honest, because these alternatives might shift who sits at the table, but unless they break from the logic of debt-fueled expansion, the fundamental tension won't really change. For a deeper dive into this global game, I recommend my recent video on the collapse of the dollar and the BRICS payment system. They're both linked below. But there is a subtler and more corrosive effect of constant inflation. It changes behavior. When money loses value slowly, thrift transforms from virtue into a liability. Why save if tomorrow's money is worth less? Why wait when everything costs more each year? The system encourages risk, punishes caution, and demands participation in an endless race for yield. This is not just economics anymore. It weaves into the culture itself. It creates the perfect subject for a debt-driven society, anxious, forward-leaning, perpetually unsatisfied. If you live on wages, you run faster just to stay in place. If you live on assets, you glide upward, buoyed by forces most people never even noticed. Every now and then, a crisis will shake the system up. 2008 was a perfect example. A financial firestorm triggered by too much debt was doused with even more credit. The winners were the same as always, those who owned assets or knew the system's rules. When the pandemic hit just recently, unfortunately, the system repeated again, this time with money sent directly to households, but the pattern still held. Asset prices surged, wages lagged, and the old logic proved resilient. In those moments, the public is often told that greed or corporate profit caused the pain. There is truth in this, but it's also incomplete. The reality is deeper, structural, and in some sense kind of boring. As long as the system is built on expanding credit, inflation isn't a mistake, it's a maintenance tool. You know, when I think about inflation now, I don't really see a glitch or a grand conspiracy. I just see an old mechanism quietly balancing on the edge of collapse and renewal, always at somebody else's expense. It is a force that rewards those who own the future and punishes those who live in the present. If you answer the question at the beginning, or even just sat with the unease, you're already a step ahead, I think, because to see inflation clearly is to notice that it's not just about numbers, but about time, power, and the stories we tell ourselves about progress. It asks us to live forward, to accept uncertainty as the price of growth, and to remember that every system hides its cost somewhere. To think clearly about inflation, you have to hold two truths. It's both necessary and unfair. It keeps the machine running, but it also asks ordinary people to pay for the privilege. And until we're honest about that, until we see who really benefits, who is quietly left behind, the cycle will just keep repeating with new names and new currencies, but the same slow burn. For more on how the global system is shifting and what might come after the dollar, see my recent analysis on the dollar collapse and the BRICS payment systems, which are both linked below. If this kind of thinking resonates with you, if you want to understand how to navigate the noise, the hype, and the complexity of our current moment, I think you'd really enjoy my book. It's called Awake, the Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Self-Lies. And it's written for people who want to stay grounded, think clearly, and live in reality even when the world makes that feel impossible. I've also included a 24-minute podcast episode where we unpack some ideas behind Awake in a more relaxed, conversational way, perfect if you prefer to listen while walking, driving, or just taking a break from screens. You'll find the link to everything down below. I'd love to know what you think of it. As always, thank you for being here and for thinking through these questions with me. If you like the conversation, consider subscribing for more, and don't forget to check out these other videos that I've linked here. It's a natural next step for a deeper dive.